Ladies and gentlemen, the president of Stony Brook University, Dr. Samuel L. Stanley, Jr.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. 1 month from today, Americans will be heading to the polls for what may be the most important election of our lifetime. Who will become the next president of the United States? How will our choice affect the future of our country? We are privileged to have with us this afternoon Margaret Jay, the Right Honorable the Baroness Jay of Paddington, a dedicated leader and former broadcast journalist who can speak about the unprecedented political issues facing the United States and the United Kingdom. After she shares her views on the new populism in America and Britain, what has happened to our politics, you may come away with a new outlook on our upcoming election and the issues facing our respective governments. Baroness Jay is a pioneer of women's issues and has long-standing interests in health and constitutional affairs. Her involvement in politics began at a very young age as the daughter of James Callaghan, a noted Labour politician and a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. After graduating from Oxford University with a degree in politics, philosophy, and economics, Baroness Jay joined the BBC and began a 20-year career in broadcasting. She was primarily involved as a producer and journalist in news and current affairs. During this period, she was a member of successive National Health Service authorities in London and involved in local committees on health research and development. In the late 1970s, she lived in Washington, D.C. as representative of the British government, a role that gave her a keen insight into American politics. In 1992, she was appointed as a working peer to the House of Lords by the Labour Party and held opposition front bench posts during the 1990s. During this time, she also chaired the Shopping Hours Reform Council, which successfully lobbied to change the law on Sunday trading in 1994. Following the Labour Party election to victory in 1997, Baroness Jay was appointed a role in Prime Minister Tony Blair's government. She first became a Minister of State in the Department of Health, and later, in 1998, was appointed to the Cabinet as Leader of the House of Lords, Lord Privy Seal, and Minister for Women. As Minister for Women, she pushed for changes in government policy, such as the introduction of the minimum wage, working families tax credit, and record increases in child benefits. In 2001, she retired from the cabinet, but remains active in the House of Lords and continues to serve on various committees. In 2007, she served as the co-chair of the Iraq Commission, set up by the Foreign Policy Center and Channel 4 Television to review the United Kingdom's policy in Iraq. She has also acted as a political consultant and is chair of the independent research organization, the Overseas Development Institute. Baroness Jay has gracefully navigated the ever-changing seas of government, always with a focus on what she could do to improve the lives of others. I look forward to hearing her vision on the state of politics in both our countries. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Baroness Margaret Jay of Paddington.
President Stanley, thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction. It's a great honor for me to be here to deliver this presidential lecture, particularly when I hear the line of extremely distinguished speakers who have been here before me. And I'm delighted to have this chance to revisit Stony Brook University. I first came to this vibrant campus to see the fascinating work on the origins of man being done here by my old friends, Richard and Meave Leakey. And they're doing that, as you will all be aware, in collaboration with their Turkana Basin Institute in Kenya. And when I was here too, I heard about the extraordinary opportunities which are given to Stony Brook University students to visit that institute in Kenya, an experience I would think, given that they have the opportunity to do field work in this very, very particularly fascinating and unique environment, that must stay with them all their lives. But this afternoon, as you know, I'm not here to talk about mankind's ancient history, but about the extraordinary political circumstances we all find ourselves in today. But in thinking about this, I was again intrigued by Richard Leakey's own introduction to his work. Nobody knows, he wrote, where we are going, but everyone should be aware where we came from. And personally, I think it may very well be needed that we have a perspective covering millennia to make sense of what's happening in the political life, both of the United States and the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, we've just decided to leave the international organization, the European Union, which has guaranteed both the peace and the prosperity of that continent for many decades. And here you're faced with a presidential election, a choice between the two most unpopular candidates ever, and immersed in a campaign which I must have heard described as unprecedented and ugly 100 times in the last 48 hours since I've been here. And of course, I should declare my own personal political interests. President Stanley has referred to the fact that I am a member of the British Labour Party, and I must say that if I was a citizen in the United States, I suspect that I would probably be an automatic Democratic voter. And those views will, of course, colour everything I say and must be, in a sense, a form of health warning. And I'm sure there are probably widely different views in this audience this afternoon. There always are whenever one meets an intelligent, interested group of people. And I look forward to the discussion which I believe President Stanley and I are going to have later, perhaps addressing some of the questions which may arise from what I say. But I hope I won't offend anyone if I repeat a short message from a blackboard outside a coffee shop in Washington, D.C. You probably know the sort of thing. It usually says something like, breakfast served all day, there's unlimited coffee. But this chalked message read, Britain and America are having a competition. Who can screw up their country first? Britain is now in the lead, but we have a trump card. I thought it was a pithy summary, and I hope no one's offended. So perhaps I could start by reminding you what has happened in the United Kingdom in the last few months. On June the 23rd, the United Kingdom decided in a referendum to leave the EU after 43 years of membership. The popular vote was 52% to leave and 48% to remain. And by common consent, this was the most momentous decision which our electorate had taken since the Second World War. And it was a result which confounded not only the polling experts and the commentators, but also the political establishment and the markets, particularly the political establishment, including the Prime Minister, Mr. David Cameron, who resigned within a very few hours of the result being known. Now, why did the British people make this shattering decision, and what happens next? I'll try later to give some pointers to the future, although I must say that the crystal ball, even after 4 months, is still very murky. But let me try to first highlight why Brexit happened. And this is where I think you may find some interesting comparisons and similarities between the UK and the USA. The 52% of the British population, which was for leaving Europe, has been described as the angry middle. These voters weren't exclusively people at the bottom of the economic pile. They are the so-called have-a-bits, not the have-nots and have-nothings. And they're often those who in a previous generation would probably have called themselves skilled working class. Many of those who wanted out were relatively prosperous and relatively well educated, and included older people as well as those of working age. The hard facts are these, that in the UK, the median income for working people aged between 31 and 59 has been stagnant since 2007. And following the global financial crash, which we all remember in 2008, it's been easy for Brits to blame those flatlining living standards on, quote, globalisation, which they see as meaning that jobs are exported, and on the EU, which means that labour is imported. Perhaps I could just give you an anecdotal example. It's from a city which I know reasonably well because a cousin of mine is the local Member of Parliament. Stoke-on-Trent in the West Midlands has been famous for many, many years as the centre and the home of famous pottery manufacturers. Wedgwood, for example, started there. Today, most of these companies have moved their production abroad, where skilled makers of porcelain are to be found at much lower costs than in the British West Midlands. And at the same time, Stoke has seen an influx of workers from European countries who seem to be flooding the employment market just when traditional jobs are drying up. Local voters, not surprisingly, see this as totally negative in personal terms. But of course, the EU is the largest free trade area in the world, and half of Britain's goods and services are traded in that single market. And in that way, it's a huge economic advantage. But the free market also includes free movement of labour, free movement of people. And it was this movement of people, in other words, immigration, which became the dominant factor in the referendum. Again, what are the facts? Under the EU treaties, any one of the 500 million citizens of the 28 members of the Union has the right to live and work in any country of the Union. And the latest figures for the last year show that net migration into the UK was 330,000 extra people added to a population, and that's well over 250,000 in 12 months. And that's very much seen as an enormous number to be absorbed into an economy which is only just now, really, coming out of the long-term recession which followed the global crash. And there's no doubt that there are many British communities where the presence of new immigrants has changed everyday life, whether it's the population of schools or the use of hospital services, and that makes the resident population uncomfortable. I don't recognise the town I was brought up in, is a critical comment which is often heard. The Spanish bar in the shopping centre may be all right, may be an advantage, but I want my next-door neighbour to speak English. And this kind of general unfamiliarity has translated into specific political anger when voters see the newcomers benefiting unfairly, as they believe it, from the UK's generous and general social welfare programmes. And it's easy to caricature, and I have to say the media often do this, that continental European enthusiasm for relocating to Britain is based on an enthusiasm for our employment and family benefits, as well as so-called health tourism, to use our National Health Service. On the other hand, many Brits live and work in Europe as well. And interestingly, recent research has shown that unemployed Britons living in Europe are drawing much more in benefits and allowances in the wealthy EU countries than their nationals are claiming in Britain. At least 30,000 British nationals, for example, are claiming unemployment benefits around the EU. And the research shows that 4 times as many Britons obtain unemployment benefits in Germany as Germans do in the UK. And overall, there are about 3 million Britons living and working in neighbouring countries of the continent of Europe. So let's be clear. The fact is that EU migrants have been a huge benefit in Britain. They bring much needed skills and they contribute tax revenues that far outweigh their demands on social benefits. Notably, the Brits who own businesses and manage factories were overwhelmingly in favour of staying in the EU. But of course, businessmen and industrialists who employ skilled workers are classed in the popular jargon as, quote, the elite, people who they believe have escaped unscathed from the changes in global economies and may indeed have actually got richer. Why should they care, was the attitude during the referendum campaign. The other so-called elite group who appeared to be indifferent to change were the politicians. The political establishment, while they extolled the virtues of vast economic markets and internationalism, were seen by many of their constituents to be struggling and to be ignoring them while they were struggling in uncharted waters. Of course, these are caricatures, but they nonetheless struck home with large parts of the electorate. Overall, I think you can sum up the generally sour, negative mood during the referendum campaign by 2 responses to 2 general opinion surveys. In the first, as many as 2/3 of those polled of UK citizens said, "I am dissatisfied with the way my country is working." And replying to a second question, only 5% thought the world as a whole was improving. Overall, there was a deep sense of insecurity. So against this background, it's not surprising that many people wanted to strike out at those they thought responsible, both for their pessimism and their insecurity, to use a referendum vote against both the Westminster government, the UK government, and the EU authorities in Brussels. And there's no doubt that the leaders of the Leave campaign cleverly and successfully exploited this mood. They played on the electorate's fear of what was and persuaded them to take a much bigger risk, in my view, with what might be. Does this sound familiar to this American audience? To me, it does. To me, it all sounds amazingly similar to what I'm learning about the presidential election here. There seem to be frankly uncanny similarities between Mr. Trump's campaign and this, and you really need go no further than the echoing slogans across the Atlantic. In the United States, you're asked to vote for Mr. Trump to make America great again. In the United Kingdom, the slogan was, support Brexit to take back control. So can we call this the new populism? And I think importantly, what do we mean by that in 2016? Populism is certainly a buzzword amongst journalists and commentators this year, and at the same time it's attracted a great deal of recent interest from political scientists. Professor Cass Muda, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, of the University of Georgia, is an academic whose work in this field has a very distinguished reputation. And his authoritative view is that populism, and I quote him, is a thin-centred ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. Now, this definition, of course, begs the question of whether it's indeed possible to divide complicated modern societies so simply and precisely, and whether or not the so-called elite must always be corrupt. Nevertheless, the idea of the people versus the elite certainly plays into the language of today's debate. Nigel Farage, who spearheaded the United Kingdom Leave campaign as the leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, claimed very loudly after the Brexit vote that it was a victory for real people. Mr. Farage has now come to share a platform with Mr. Trump, where both spoke enthusiastically about giving a voice to the silent majority. And we are told Mr. Trump's supporters are convinced that they're being ripped off by a club of insiders who range from Washington politicians through big business leaders to the cultural establishment, probably including universities like this one. And as we know, conspiracy theories abound. Now, does this all tell us much about the policies of populists? I think very little, which is why Professor Muda called populism a thin-centred, a thin-centred ideology. And why, in Europe, the term populist has been applied to European political parties with such widely differing views as Syriza in Greece and the Front National, the National Front in France. In this country, I've noted too that both Senator Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are said to have had a common populist appeal, but very obviously no common policy. So personally, given that limitation, I'm attracted to the extension of the definition of populism, most recently highlighted by an Australian academic who's now working in this country. Benjamin Moffat has just published a book called The Rise of Global Populism, and he asserts that populism is primarily a political style. According to him, the successful populist is defined by what he calls a performative style of communication, which is blunt and often aggressive in manner and simple and crude in its messages. The style, the manner, particularly if it can be called just everyday common sense, appeals to those who feel excluded from a complicated, conventional political argument. Again, it's us versus them. And this isn't about ideology or belief. Any leader from anywhere on the political spectrum, on the policy front, from far right to far left, can, with the right skills and the right attributes, become a key performer of contemporary populism. And I would suggest, particularly if they have a background in reality television. Now, as an aside, I don't think we should underestimate the importance of the media in partly creating and certainly promoting this new type of populism. Traditional mainstream media, that's newspapers, broadcast news, have always enjoyed the extreme, the colourful and the provocative. It keeps their own show on the road, especially in this era of competitive 24-hour news cycles. But of course, the most powerful, extraordinary new phenomenon is that of the internet, of social media, which is built on instant image and quick message. Twitter comments can go viral and trend in seconds. And after all, why should we automatically judge that a point made in 149 characters is less valid than, say, a learned 1,000-word pamphlet? Well, I'm afraid I'm prepared to stick my old-fashioned neck out and insist I do get a more considered, more useful opinion from the pamphlet. But I know I'm in a minority. The tweet may well reach millions who would otherwise not read any political message. But, as is often pointed out, the internet can act mainly as an echo chamber with the same shorthanded opinions going round and round. Personally, I think the analysts of today's populists, today's successful populists, have so far paid too little attention to their use of social media. It's something I think which could well interest political analysts, political scientists in the universities. Perhaps there's a political scientist here at Stony Brook who could lead the way up this particular mountain. It would certainly be worth doing, I think. So to go back to today's populist leaders, to the individuals, one paradox which has been explored and extensively commented on is that although these leaders claim to speak for and from the people, they're often not ordinary Joes themselves. As Ben Moffat writes, they manage to be of the people and transcend the people at the same time. If we look at some of the examples, if we look at Silvio Berlusconi, 3 times Prime Minister of Italy, he won his elections on populist tickets, but Berlusconi is a billionaire media mogul. In England, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, who led the triumphant Brexit campaign, certainly come from comfortable establishment backgrounds. They have none of the economic insecurities which produced much of their support. Both could indeed be called conventional politicians, part of the conspiracy elite. Farage, perhaps surprisingly, is still a member of the European Parliament, and Johnson, who's now become Britain's Foreign Secretary, was previously Mayor of London. And of course, as you all know, Mr. Trump's privileged circumstances here are very well understood. Nevertheless, all these people appear to want to identify completely with the concerns of the millions of so-called real people. They employ the populist style of plain, sometimes coarse presentations, decrying the political establishment and expert opinion. They employ that style, they advocate populism, and at least in Europe, they've won. Now, the all-important question for the whole world is, can this type of populism succeed here? The presidential election is still a month away, but across the Atlantic, we've been living with the referendum result, with Brexit, for almost 4 months. And I should be able to give you some pointers about Britain's future outside the EU. But even today, I can't truly see a clear way ahead, let alone a destination. We haven't moved very much forward since the night of June the 23rd, when the BBC anchorman starkly announced, "We're out." During the summer months, the new Prime Minister, Mrs. Theresa May, who gets justifiable plaudits for her calm, pragmatic handling of the vote's chaotic aftermath, has sheltered behind her first statement when she said Brexit means Brexit. But of course, the rapid follow-up has been, and so, what does Brexit mean? It's a crisp phrase, but given really no indication of the direction on the major policy issues which face us. Will the UK leave the free trade zone, leave the free single market? Will we abandon our largest market to prevent continuing free immigration from the European Union? Or will we try to achieve a compromise on both free trade and free labour movement? And what happens to the 3 million European citizens living in Britain and to the Brits in the EU? We're also still unclear about the process of withdrawal. Mrs. May has said that she hopes to trigger the vital and critical Article 50 of the European Lisbon Treaty before April 2017. This should start the clock on the divorce, formal negotiations to leave. The treaty states that the time limit on that negotiation is 2 years. But is this going to be enough? For example, the Prime Minister's government machine contains very few trade negotiators because for the last 40 years, they've either worked in Brussels or everything we've negotiated has been through the Brussels machinery. And in Whitehall, the experts on domestic legislation, on laws which simply affect Britain, say that there are about 80,000 pages of statute law that will have to be looked at and may need to be amended or indeed abandoned. The House of Lords has just conducted a forensic inquiry into how we leave. And one witness, a former judge of the European Court of Justice, seemed to sum it up when he said, "The long-term ghastliness of the legal complications is almost unimaginable." A very good judge remark, which I suspect is right. Now, all of this suggests that Theresa May's new government could well be overwhelmed by an absolute tsunami of exit administration. But there are already other serious problems, serious political problems, which have emerged post the referendum and which need to be addressed. First and foremost, the major constitutional question: will the United Kingdom itself stay together? The four constituent parts, the four countries of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which make up the UK, certainly demonstrated their separateness and differences in the referendum. The people of England and Wales both voted to leave the EU, while those of Northern Ireland and Scotland wanted to remain. Scotland, which is led by the charismatic First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, from the Nationalist Independence Party, voted solidly to stay in the EU. Not one of the 32 districts in Scotland wanted to leave. And Miss Sturgeon has made it clear that she doesn't intend to let her country, quote, be dragged out of the EU against its will. Although it's unclear, frankly, what status Scotland would have in the Union were it to become independent. But nonetheless, it's pretty certain that the government in Edinburgh will now try to stage another vote on independence, on going it alone, before very long. And given that European referendum result, it may very well be successful. And across the Irish Sea, in Northern Ireland, where they also gave a large majority to remain, the old issues of the north-south border with the Southern Republic, all those issues about security and nationalism have come to the fore again. I spent most of the summer in the Irish southwest and found that in the pubs there, the question of border and trade were troubling the local populations, and they were the hot topics of the season. John Oliver, the British comedian who you're probably much more familiar with than I am, since we don't see his programmes in the UK, but he's just won an Emmy Award here for his hit TV show Last Week Tonight, probably got it right. He was very widely quoted as saying, "Post-Brexit, even the name United Kingdom sounds ironic." One other troubling issue which has unfortunately bubbled to the surface post the Brexit vote concerns community relations in different parts of the country. Very sadly, the triumph of an anti-immigrant platform is driving a nasty wedge, an unpleasant divide in local communities, and even leading to so-called hate crimes, which sometimes involve physical attacks on foreign workers. For example, police records show that after the referendum in the county of Kent, hate crime increased by 143% compared with the same period last year. And in the county of Lincolnshire, the increase was as high as 191%. Both these are areas which voted heavily to leave and where emotions against the large number of immigrants are easily stirred up. And I'm afraid Brexit may have given a green light, really, to racism. But of course, the truth is that however much some of the indigenous population might want to see it happen, resident workers from the European Union are not going to disappear overnight. Indeed, the united political view is that those already in the country should be guaranteed a right to remain there. Hopefully, the fractious mood will settle down, but it may not if new populist firebrands emerge to incite division. One Northern MP has already described her constituency in the industrial city of Leeds as a tinderbox. And I suspect the problem is that the Leave voters could well be persuaded that yet again the politicians have conned them, have persuaded them to do something, and even their momentous choice to leave the EU has made very little practical difference to their lives. So what do I think will happen? Optimistically, I have to hope that the British, with their time-honoured tradition, will muddle through. We will make some accommodation on access to the European free market. We will negotiate a more managed programme of future immigration. The United Kingdom won't disintegrate, and we will develop a sort of 21st century version of federalism for the British Isles. The Prime Minister's new ambition of what she calls a country that works for everyone may, if it's successful, bring some of the society divisions together. But as I say, this is an optimistic version, and it needs very skillful, and I would say non-populist leadership to achieve it. I believe it's true, even if it's unfortunate, that the complex problems of today's globalization, of today's world, require complex analysis, complex debate, and complex policy solutions. I don't think they are answerable in the Twitter sphere, particularly when those type of slogans appeal to the extremes of either left or right. In my view, the challenge today, and this is probably a challenge which faces the United States as well, is to rebuild the centre ground of politics, to seek compromise and a sense of collective responsibility and collective ambition. And that sense of responsibility, I would suggest, must honestly recognise the pluralism, the diversity of today's societies. We can't solve our global problems by becoming fortress nation states. It's certainly not an easy ambition, and in our democracies on both sides of the Atlantic, we need to find new popular, I emphasise popular, not populist ideas, which connect to the people who genuinely feel insecure and excluded. Personally, I'm now looking to the next generation of leaders to take up this challenge, and I'm sure some of them are probably here amongst some of the students I've already met today at Stony Brook. All I can say to them is you'll need very good fortune and very good judgment. I'm afraid I can't suggest any easy answers either here or in my own country, but I'd like to leave you with one headline message. The centre in politics must hold. Thank you very much.
That was so stimulating, and I think we're going to have a great discussion. I want to elaborate a little bit, and I have questions that came in from the audience, from people who submitted questions, and I think I'm going to begin with some of those, and then I have some of my own as well. I think you alluded to this in your comments, and I think talked about it actually very well, but on the most basic level, do you think the nativist, anti-immigrant feelings in the United States, what we're seeing in this campaign, and Europe, as we saw in Brexit, I think, spring from the same or similar sources?
Well, I wouldn't want to pretend that I'm an expert on everything that's happened in the United States economy, or indeed in the different economies which spread out across this enormous country, which is a bit different from our very small island economy. But on the other hand, it does seem to me, and I'm using second-hand sources because it's what I've heard rather than what I've lived through, that some of those problems about exporting jobs, about seeing that that work that was done by skilled workers in industrial towns particularly can be done more cheaply in other countries. And here I suppose one of the problems is the countries of the Pacific Rim are perceived as being the alternative sources of skilled labour, do make people feel very insecure, and particularly if they're working in a field or in a trade which has been done by their father, their grandfather, and so on and so forth. If this is suddenly swept away and they're told, as I gave in the example of Stoke-on-Trent, that those people who have made Wedgwood china, Royal Dilton china or something for generations are now being replaced by people in Indonesia. Now that's not Europe. They're not being replaced by European workers, but nonetheless they have this sense of insecurity, and that makes them very anti those people who they feel have created these markets.
One of the things that people talked about, at least so I'm in the same position of not understanding Brexit as well, but one of the things I heard when it was talked about was the idea that there was misinformation out there, and that in fact regions of Great Britain that economically it made total sense for them to remain in the European Union. In fact, some of those regions voted to exit. Is misinformation a problem, and do you see this as a growing problem in politics where people feel more comfortable basically providing misinformation or even lying, essentially, about things?
Well, I mean, the word is the post-truth world of politics, isn't it? Post-truth politics. It's an easy phrase, but I think it does have some resonance and some truth. There were things said during, and this was where I would say that populism, in a sense, played a negative role, because they were things which sounded easily right, and yet were obviously never going to happen. For example, in Brexit, the Leave campaign had a bus which they rented, which toured the country, which had painted on the side, if we leave, there'll be £350 million for the NHS. Now, what this was about was that they calculated, it's not necessarily an unchallenged figure, that we contributed £350 million, didn't matter over what time period, to the EU budget. And that if we left, this would be money which could be spent directly on our health service. Now, this was an obvious nonsense. I mean, the equation just didn't add up, because clearly that money wouldn't be repatriated and siphoned into the NHS budget. But it was something which people felt seemed to be something which was very attractive. Why couldn't we use that money? Why couldn't we do it like that? And I think that was verging on an untruth, because it was so much more complicated than that slogan, and that's what I mean by the populist approach to a sloganized argument, that it really attracted people, although it didn't have much foundation in reality.
One of the things that people bring up is the fact that there, at least in our country at this moment in time in this election, there seems to be a dichotomy between the highly educated and less educated in terms of how they view these particular issues. And again, it's back to the point, do people vote their best interests? And part of that has to do with understanding and education. Do we in universities have a responsibility to do a better job of educating people on these things?
I would be very interesting to see. I only know the statistics because, of course, they're the only ones which have emerged. It would be very interesting to see what the statistics emerge on your presidential election. But on Brexit, the proportions were that of the people who had higher education, i.e. had been graduates, or even more so with people who had done postgraduate work, there was 75% in favour of the remaining in the European Union. You could say, well, they understood the arguments, or you could say it was their economic self-interest. You know, it depends which side of the coin you were talking to. But on the other hand, if you looked at those people who had no scholarship qualifications, who had left school with a minimum of scholarship equations or exams, they were 75% against. So there was an obvious comparison or collaboration between the people who had higher education and those who voted one way or another. But of course that was a binary question. It wasn't, so it was more complicated than one in the normal political sphere.
So you've been a politician, you serve in the House of Lords. One of the things that's come across in the United States is the notion of a breakdown of civility, essentially in politics, where people are no longer showing each other the same respect as we've had in the past. Is that happening in Britain as well? Certainly we feel as though it's happening in the United States.
I think it has happened a bit in Britain. Certainly there have been, outbreaks, as I said, of this rather unpleasant sort of what we call race hatred, which is often just, people being extremely unpleasant and vociferously outrageous to people in the street, and they can now be prosecuted on the basis of doing something like that, provided it's sufficiently exacerbated a local problem or whatever it may be. But I think, I was always brought up, and I hope I'll be forgiven for saying this, I was always brought up to say that one shouldn't really comment directly on the foreign politics of another country, particularly when you're lucky enough to be a visitor there. But I did find the presidential debate on Sunday night was very dark and very unpleasant, and I was worried about the impact that would have on many people around, not just this country, but around the world, because of course we look to the United States as very much a focus of democracy and the democratic process, and the fact that that could happen here, I think, will worry a lot of much less sophisticated democracies and much less developed political discussion in other parts of the world.
To return to the idea of populism, and we've talked about it in England as well as in the United States, But of course, there's things taking place in other countries, and
Yes,
you
of
alluded
course.
to it as well. In 2012, the Italian Prime Minister, Mario Monti, called for a European Council on populism, basically to address that. That council never took place. Is this something we should think about doing, and should the U.S. be invited?
Yeah, well, I think the US certainly should be invited, but I'm not sure that we necessarily will advance enormously by having a council of that kind.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me it might be more of a sort of enjoyable talking shop along the lines of some of the people who I mentioned in my remarks, the people who've been studying this. I do think there is an opportunity for political science departments and political commentators to think more clearly about what this word means, and when they use it so generally and use it across the whole spectrum, as I said, you can apply, people have applied populism to both Senator Sanders and to Mr. Trump, who obviously have very little in common, but they are both described in this way, and I think it would be useful to have some more exact and useful academic work on that, which would then hopefully expand into the commentary sphere.
What about the referendum as a tool for democracy and for making state decisions? As you know, we have Brexit. Last week, surprisingly, in Colombia, the people voted in a referendum not to end a 52-year-old civil war, essentially, that had been taking place. What do you think, and how does this tie into populism and the roles of referenda?
I'm not an enthusiast, really, for referendums. I think there are states in this country, I know in California, they use it very often and very regularly as a way of testing out opinion on very specific bits of policy. I think when you have a very large national question, which, as I said, is generally, for example, the referendum in Britain, acknowledged to be the biggest decision that we've made since the Second World War, and to have it presented in that simple binary form, you don't necessarily get an answer, not the answer you want, because I'm not making the mistake of saying the electorate is wrong, but you may have all of the imposition of different strands of thinking, which I tried to explain, and I think that was, although I haven't followed it in great detail, I think that was also true in Colombia.
So stepping back a little bit and just looking at this world we're in currently, and from your perspective, we've talked about populism as potential threat. What are the other kind of international threats that Britain and the United States do you think share at this point in time as you look diplomatically?
Well, I do think we've seen an extraordinary resurgence of a potential threat from Russia. I think we are seeing a potential threat if we try to be more isolationist about our trade arrangements. And I think those are things which can play into each other. I think obviously in Europe we feel the concern about some of the Russian activity in the what we used to call the old eastern states of Europe, the old previous communist states. But I mean the United States is very much involved in the Middle East, where again there is a much more exacerbated reality, I think, to a potential Russian aggression of whether it's a diplomatic or a military kind. And I think those are two areas, the trade and the Russian position, that we should be very careful about.
So looking back, there's been times in world history when populist movements have arisen, and some have turned into things like fascism and so on. Do you see parallels as you look back and we think about in history? I know you weren't there then, but as we read about what was happening in continental Europe in the 20s and so on, are there parallels that you can see?
Well, people talk about that, and they describe some of the things which have happened, particularly in southern Europe, as potentially fascist. I think it's awfully difficult always to try to make one's decisions about what to do now, or indeed what to think about the future, on the basis of what happened before, because the 1930s, after all, were extraordinarily difficult in many different ways. I think we should be careful not to ignore the lessons of history. I mean, it's one of the problems that people just say, oh, well, we can't fight that battle again, it's completely different. Obviously, there are strands where you can see similarities, but that's why in what I was saying, was trying to identify this type of populism which is being studied and experienced now, because I think it is probably different, although the strands of some of the activities, particularly of populist leaders, could probably be said to be rather similar to past history.
Let me get back again to the issues around trade, and again, as a member of Parliament, and this is clearly something that's taking place in the United States. This notion of free trade versus protectionism. We have people saying, "I would protect jobs," and we're not going to import steel or whatever. You're thinking about this, and
I think it's incredibly complicated because of all the social and economic reasons for individuals and for individual communities that I mentioned, which obviously, as I said when you asked me the first question, apply in some degree in the industrial parts of this country and places where people have traditionally made very skilled and important products and now feel under threat. And this is one of the reasons I feel it's such a disadvantage to the United Kingdom that we have abandoned or are abandoning the European Union, because collectively, that market of 500 million people, that collective trade organization of 28 very disparate countries, provided a sense of there being an internal free trade arrangement with all of the difficulties about free labor, which enabled us to say that we weren't being protectionist, but yet we were collectively operating in a way which was trying to advantage that part of Europe. And I think now we're going to have enormous difficulties because we will have to negotiate trade agreements with everybody individually. Each one, I'm told, takes about 7 years on average. And the problems for doing that are, in practical terms, extraordinary. Otherwise, we have to go back to being protected, if that's the appropriate word. I don't think it probably is, by the general agreement on tariff and trades, and that will be a big disadvantage. So I think from the perspective, the rather narrow perspective of individual UK interests, we have made a huge mistake in abandoning that particular form of trade and economic arrangement.
So the United Kingdom has had a woman Prime Minister.
Indeed, two.
Right, two now with Ms. May, and the United States has never had a woman president. Are we trailing in terms of gender equity as you look at the countries? I know you don't want to be a bad visitor, but what is your thinking about what's going on in our country?
Because I was, as you said in your kind open introduction, I was Minister for Women quite a long time ago now, and one of the countries that we always look to in terms of understanding the way in which women were advantaged and did rise to positions of authority was this one. I think we trailed you for a long time in positions of women on boards, and women in senior academic jobs, women in senior government jobs. We were quite a long way behind. I think we have now begun to pick up and catch up. And I think the advantage of people like Theresa May, and I imagine Hillary Clinton, and certainly of someone like Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, is that they do recognise the advantage of having women around them. One of the disadvantages about Margaret Thatcher, who was seen as the icon of women's leadership, was that although she was indeed an icon in many ways, she never encouraged other women. And her cabinet never included any other women. And I think now we've got to the stage where it's generally understood that if you have a mixed team, you will achieve more than having an exclusive one, either exclusive gender men or exclusive gender women.
Yeah, this is a major issue. I'll just to say something about Stony Brook, just a major issue for us at Stony Brook University, where we're part of the UN Women's He for She initiative, one of 10 universities designed to promote gender equity. And I think we're taking a very hard look at what we're doing on the university. At the same time, there's 10 corporate partners working for corporations to take a look at what they're doing, 10 leading corporations, including Unilever and others, and then 10 nation states. And the idea then is to really begin to make commitments about what we're going to do and change and then build them. So I think we still, as you well know, have a lot of work to do in the United States, but I think it's nice to know this is important.
Can I reverse the positions and ask you a question? Do you believe that you can make progress on that by having quotas?
I think what's very important is to take a look, essentially, at where we are and understand. I think there's some things I think you should dictate. So I would like to see, for example, people doing the same job receiving the same pay. That makes sense. So women who are doing the same job as men need to receive the same pay. That, I think, is simple. I think we can't use lower numbers in particular areas sometimes as excuses. That's done. So people will say, I need to hire a new engineering professor, but there's not enough women in engineering. Well, if you look and you look hard, you can address that issue. So I think sometimes we use those as excuses rather than doing it. I think it's hard in some areas to use quotas, and in some cases it may be illegal according to our employment laws. But I think we really have to be held accountable, essentially, for how we're doing in those areas. And again, that's part of what we're doing. We've released a document that basically looks at our undergraduate population, our graduate student population, looks at the senior leadership of the university, looks at our faculty, tenured, non-tenured, and so on, and just asks, what are the distributions? And I think we benchmark with the other universities. And as I said before, universities are competitive. So if we know that University X is doing better than us, then I think that's going to spur us and other universities to do better.
I mean, I think what we've learnt is that there is huge advantage in having the kind of initiative that you're driving from the top, as it were. I mean, we had a big controversy in the UK several years ago because Norway have adopted a statute law about the numbers of people, gender balance on corporate boards and in other areas. And there was considerable pressure from the European Union, actually, that the other countries should adopt that, and very great resistance to it in the UK, and we never did. But it did spur, particularly in the corporate sector, some named leadership people to take this on, so that within 4 years we've moved to a situation where there is no company in the FTSE 100, which of course is our top companies, which doesn't have a proportion of women on the board. But it didn't involve a law, it just involved a certain amount of kind of arm twisting and leadership.
So this has been a fantastic conversation, and I've really enjoyed it so much. And you've kind of alluded to this again, but I don't know if I'm seeking reassurance or just that, are these current times an anomaly? Is this an anomaly right now, what the election in the United States, Brexit, or this just happened to be of this circumstance and time? Or is there a fundamental threat to democracy? And are we in danger, essentially, for a number of reasons of slipping into a darker political time?
I very much hope not. I have to say, the last few months have not made me optimistic. I don't really think there's a threat to democracy in either of our countries. But as I said, when I was concluding what I said, I do think that we have to fight harder for the centre. We have to resist the easy opportunities of the slogans of the extremes. And the centre seems more boring, but it's actually more responsible, and it involves a kind of collective approach, which enables us, I think, to heal some of the divisions, which at the moment do seem pretty extreme and do exacerbate the sense, that we're all going downhill. I just very much hope that we don't go downhill in terms of our exclusion from the major economic arrangement in Europe. And I hope you, as it were, emerge from the presidential race with a sense of a very good new president.
That's well put. So please join me in thanking Baroness Jay so much for her insights.